Welcome back to the Not Yet Adults podcast. This, of course, is a podcast where Collin Geffrey and myself, Eric Zayas, talk about being an adult and figuring out adult things and talking about different topics, how they affected us as kids and how they affect us as adults, and just all that kind of thing. How are you doing, Collin?
I'm doing well, Eric. It's really hard. I feel like you do a way better job at introing this show than I do, because the show is so nebulous, and so like sometimes we're really in the weeds, sometimes we're very much in like an abstract general sense, and so it can be very hard in like 20 seconds to be like, well, here's what the show is. And so I feel like whenever I intro, I just kind of assume like, yeah, you've probably listened to them before, so like I don't really know what you want from me. But no, I feel like you have a really good like elevator pitch.
I appreciate that, but like right before you said that, one of the last things I said while introing was like all of the thing. I just realized I said all of the thing.
But see, here's the thing.
And don't you dare cut that out.
If you hadn't drawn attention to it, no one would have known.
Well,
like
I know.
You know, but
I
no
would
one
have
else
known.
wouldn't. You could have taken it to the grave, man.
All right, Collin, do you have any particular ideas of what we should talk about in this particular episode? I'm saying that word a lot now, of the Not Yet Adults podcast?
Yeah, so we sort of have this, we both sort of have these growing lists of topics we want to get to at some point. And occasionally we'll throw a topic out that we know we want to do, but maybe takes a little bit more time. And so like something like music doesn't take that long to plan that episode. We can kind of just jump in. But other episodes that are a little bit more nebulous or are more of a concept as opposed to a thing, take a little bit more planning time. And that's sort of what we have today. And so the episode that we're doing today is on nostalgia, which is very much this kind of broad, murky, you know what it is, but you don't really think about it as a concept. You have the feeling of nostalgia, but I feel like rarely do you actually sit down and think about what nostalgia is as a concept. And so I'd kind of like to do that today, of just have this sort of abstract top level discussion on just what is nostalgia, how does it make us feel, where does it come from, all that.
Well, I think a good place to start with a topic like that is like figuring out what nostalgia is, like looking up the definition and kind of like starting from there. So do you want me to like look it up real quick? And
let's do it, man. Yeah, because I have the Wikipedia version here, and I think you had found a different version, but that's okay. I mean, there's going to be more than one definition, so I mean, let's just start throwing stuff out.
Read yours first. I want to see if it's matches up with mine.
So I'm on just the Wikipedia version of nostalgia. First line: nostalgia is a sentimentality, for the past, typically for a period or place with happy personal associations. The word nostalgia is a learned formation of a Greek compound consisting of nostos, meaning homecoming, and a Homeric word, algos, a Homeric word, algos, meaning pain or ache. So it's sort of that idea of home and familiarity and where you used to be, and then also the pain and ache, I guess we could take from that, sort of a dull pain. So it's not like a sharp pain, but it's sort of like that aching longing for how things kind of used to be.
Yeah, my Google search is pretty much producing the same thing. So I'll be just a broken record if I read it, but because it's like I think the Google search took it from the Wikipedia page. But
the thing that stands out to me there is, when I feel like nostalgia is not a word that crops up in normal conversation very often, but when you do talk about nostalgia, I feel like people at a glance have a tendency to have like a positive association with it. Of it's like, oh, I remember when we were kids and my friend and we used to hang out and do that thing, or I remember this game I used to play, or whatever it is. And the definition touches on something that most people don't think about often, but I think is very much a part of nostalgia, which is sort of that pain. And it's sort of that idea of that's how things used to be, and that's how you used to be, but you can't go back to that. You know, you've kind of moved past that.
Yeah, something that like you like either watch or read that makes you feel nostalgic also reminds you like you're no longer a kid anymore, like you were like when you first experienced that thing. Or if we're like if we were older, like in our 40s or 50s or 60s, and we saw something being brought back or something referenced to that we like watched or experienced when we were in our 20s or younger, we'd be reminded of how old we are. And I mean, we're both pretty young right now, but like, so, and it kind of like upsets me when people our age say like, oh, this thing I saw when I was like 10 is brought back. I feel so old. And it's like, you're not old. It was just 10 years ago. It's not that long. It just feels weird to say I feel old yet when it's like we're still in our 20s.
Well, when people say I feel old, that's like, okay, get off your high horse. Like, come on. I mean, I think we've talked about this on the podcast before, and this is less about nostalgia and more just about like time passing. But it's sort of that idea that as you get older, because you have more time behind you, time going by, it feels like it's going faster because it's a smaller percentage of all the time you've seen. And I feel like that's sort of what it is with nostalgia of, we're 20-ish, and so 10 years is half of our life. That's a chunk. That's a big chunk. And so something happening 10 years ago for us, that does feel like a long time away. But when you're 40 or 50 and something happened 10 years ago, one, it's a much smaller chunk, but two, you're also probably a lot more similar to how you are now 10 years ago when you're 40 or 50, as opposed to, how we were when we were 10. I mean, I don't want to speak for you, but so freaking different. Like just completely different people. We're still, yeah, and I think that'll very much still be true 10 years from now, because 20 to 30 obviously is a big change too. Yeah, man, I don't know. It's easy to look back on that and be like, oh, that was so fun. That was so nice. I wish things could be that way again. But that's kind of how the brain works, I think, is you remember things a little bit better than maybe they actually were.
There's definitely the yearning of like quote unquote simpler times. And really, that I think that just means like, you know, times when there wasn't really a responsibility or like a pressure to, do certain things. Like we were in school and stuff when we were kids, and that was fine, but that was like the biggest thing. And honestly, looking back at school, like a lot of the assignments from when I was kids, like basic multiplication, like I could slay that stuff now, easy peasy. But back then, it's like, oh, it's so hard. But anyways, yeah. I think like a big, would you consider a nostalgia trigger, or I don't know, that makes it sound like it's traumatic, but yeah, and it's something that elicits nostalgia for me. Just the first, referencing specifically when I was a young kid in like kindergarten, would be like a Nintendo video game, and like there's so many franchises within the Nintendo brand that I feel like depend on nostalgia. Like you got your Super Mario's, your Mario Karts, your Mario parties, a lot of Mario products, but also like Legend of Zelda, and like even like Metroid or Star Fox games that originally came out in the 80s and were like probably at its zenith at that time, being brought back, looking updated but still very similar to how it played, how it functioned originally, because it's meant for and marketed towards people who want it because they're nostalgic for it and they have that yearning for like being a child again.
Well, and I think specifically you mentioned sort of Nintendo games. I think that's a great example of kind of the double-edged sword of nostalgia, because you do have that fondness for it and you do think back on it with kind of like rose-colored glasses. But at the same time, like try going back and playing Mario Kart on the SNES. Like, oof, wow, that's games have come a long way since then. It's real hard after playing Mario Kart 8 Deluxe on your Switch to go back and play it on the SNES. And that's not to say those games don't still have value to people, but it is that emotional weight that it has. But at the same time, entertainment and media and all these things have moved so far past it.
And I think it's fair to say that it's been, because it's been like brought back and not necessarily rebooted but remade in a sense over time, like over and over again, it's been done better since then. Like it may have a particular look, and like there's like you said, there's feelings associated with that look, and like that even just the fact that you're playing like an old game like elicits like that nostalgic positive emotions. But the functionality part of it, it's a lot like clunkier and like a lot harder to control and just a lot harder to play. Whereas the new ones, the more recent Mario Karts, like are much more smoother. But because they're new, even though they are just a remake of the original, don't have that like personal connection yet, or don't have that like nostalgia listening.
That's something that I feel like is almost inherently tied to video games, and I guess movies to a much lesser extent. But you have this idea of a remaster of they take something that was loved and that was enjoyed, and they go back and put a fresh coat of paint on it and put it out again.
Not to derail you too much real quick, but and we'll go back to this, but I think movies are just as much, if not more so, an example of something that like takes something that exists and like brings it back with a fresh coat of paint.
Sure. In the movie sense, though, it is a new movie. Like they're talking about reboots or sort of continuations. It's like they are taking something that worked and like you said, putting a fresh coat of paint on it, but it is still a new movie. It is they're not literally recreating it shot for shot, unless they do something like
Unless it's Psycho with Vince Vaughn.
unless it's Psycho or the Poltergeist but with video games, they're literally taking every single frame of that game and rebuilding it on like a modern engine with modern graphics and all of that. And it's interesting how like the first Jack and Daxter game on PS2 is one of my favorite games of all time. And I went back, this was a few years ago, and played it with a friend on a PlayStation 2. And I was like, Jesus God, how did we ever play a game that looked this trash? Because your brain sort of fills in the gaps of what something used to look like or how something used to feel with all the positive memories that you have for that. And so, playing it side by side, there's now an HD re-release of Jack and Daxter on PS3, maybe PS4 and stuff too. And that looks how you remember the game to look. Like when I look at that, I'm like, yeah, this looks great. And then you compare them side by side and you're like, oh, Jesus.
Oh yeah, I see what you mean with the like in regards to remaster, that's definitely something that's like very much a video game thing where it's like the game developers and game studios and publishers and whatnot, everyone within the game industry recognizes that this game that came out a long time ago, many consider it perfect. And so what we're going to do is literally just not change a single thing other than updating the graphics and fixing some bugs. And then we'll re-release it with like a new like logo, maybe like an updated logo or something.
And yeah, and then like with movie reboots, as we were talking about a second ago, like it's obviously not a literal remaster in the way the games are. Like they're not taking each frame and just upscaling it for 4K or whatever, though they do that with Blu-rays and stuff. But it's sort of this idea of let's take Halloween, let's take Star Wars, let's take RoboCop, let's take these things that people loved and remake it for a modern audience. And we're going to hit the same emotional points, and the story is more or less going to be the same, but we're bringing it into the modern age. And I'm real conflicted about that one because I feel like more often than not, it just comes across as lazy to me.
We're deep in the age of the soft reboot. And we talked about this in the pre-show, and I think you defined it pretty well. How'd you define a soft reboot?
It's a continuation of the franchise for people who want that, but at the same time, you could start watching there and be totally fine if you have no previous knowledge of the series before that. So it's a good jumping on point, but it's also a continuation for the people who want one.
I think for the movie studios, in a sense, it's kind of like having your cake and eating it too, because you get both the audience of people who were fans of the original and want to and are coming back because of the name, and you also get younger people who have like never seen this and don't have any emotional connection, but like need a jumping in point. Like it's another example would be in like comic books, how like every year DC like restarts at like issue number 1. Like they'll continue the comic book storylines, but they'll call like the latest issue number 1 and like volume 1, because like even though it's continuing the story, like this is, if you want to get into comics, this is where you start, and like issue number 1s sell more because of that.
But then you will have those purists who are like longtime comic book readers that'll tell you like, oh, New 52 is trash, you need to go back and read these Batman series and these Superman series and stuff like that. And that sort of people, I guess, getting like possessive over their nostalgia of being like, how I remember this is how it should be remembered, and it's almost using that as a frame of reference for others on how they should interpret stuff.
Real quick, just getting back to movies for a sec, to play devil's advocate, not that we're like super harshly criticizing like soft reboots, but there are some examples where I think it like works well, because it's like so there's something that happens that I consider kind of like a sequel series in a sense, where it's like it's based on a franchise that existed, this new movie coming out is based on this series of movies that have already happened. However, this movie is like new and like a new starting point. An example I have, the most recent example I have would be like Creed, where you have basically the Rocky franchise ended. There was Rocky 1 through 4, then Rocky 5, which no one wants to talk about, and then Rocky Balboa, which is basically Rocky 6 made years later, and that was the end of Rocky. Creed 1 came out, and while it's based in the world of Rocky, it's not his story. He's in it, but he's a secondary character, and he's like a mentor character for this new character who we're following, who has their own story, and which is very thoroughly based upon legacy, and very heavily based upon the original Rocky story and the mythos of Rocky Balboa and Apollo Creed and their friendship and their like journey. You can tell by watching a Creed, this is Adonis Creed's story. Adonis Johnson, who eventually takes up the name of Creed. Spoiler. And it's like him like trying to make his own legacy and a name for himself while under this like really heavy shadow of this man that like everyone loved, and also a big part of that is because Apollo Creed died. Everyone loves him even more because he's like no longer around, and so they have all the memories of him, and like this like almost perfect legacy.
You can watch Creed having never seen any Rocky movies in your entire life, and you can appreciate and enjoy and respect that movie. That said, you will get much more out of it if you've seen all the other Rocky movies, because it's evoking so many of the same tones and shots and conversations and plot points. And that's not to say that Creed is Rocky. It's not. It's its own thing, but there's clearly so much influence there.
If you start watching at just the first Creed movie, you still get a good movie series. But if for the people who have like watched all of Rocky and watched Creed, you get like a little extra bonus emotional impact, because there's this like Adrian's I think it's called, the restaurant Rocky owns is like Adrian's place, something like that, and that is a reference to his wife who died, and like you like see Apollo Creed, you're like, oh, I remember Carl Weathers' performance and like that character and how he brought him to life and stuff like that. But like
not to make everything about video games, but the analogy that comes to mind is like when you're playing a new game, you can just mainline it and go straight through the main quest and just do that. Or you can go off to the scenic overlook and pick up this journal and read this side quest and do all these things that just fleshes it out a little bit more. You don't need that. You can just go right through and you'll be okay. But if you want it, there's this other stuff on the side that will make you appreciate the experience even more.
Yeah, movies and video games are like probably the two biggest, what's the word I'm looking for? The biggest examples of nostalgia, in the sense of like taking old existing storylines. But there's also different forms of nostalgia where a story will heavily depend on bringing back a particular era or a particular look, and the kind of like feels those have. Like I think television shows have to do a better or a bigger like our bigger example of this. Like it shows like a Glow, for example, or there's so many like throwbacks to like the 80s in television shows and stuff like that, where like because that was such a like vibrant era, the hairstyles and the like fashion, it's kind of coming back in a big way, and that sort of like has a nostalgia of like a time. It's almost like people have a desire to like go back in time to that place, but they can't because that technology doesn't exist, so they're just bringing it back, at least look wise, with like the style and the hairstyles.
How fascinating is that, though, that you and I, as two people who were born in the 90s, we never existed in the 80s. Every piece of knowledge we have for the 80s is secondary or even tertiary at best, because like we never even lived there. But we still have a nostalgia for it. Like how fascinating is that?
Yeah, it's a nostalgia for something that we don't even have like a real firsthand like experience with, because we've seen so many movies and stuff that were made at that time, and we kind of like get like a craving for something we never even ate in the first place.
It's almost like a fondness for how you imagine something being. which is very can be very powerful, but it's also very bizarre to think about because like you don't actually know what that was. It may not, if you grew up in the 80s, it very likely would not be at all what you think it is. But because we see this sort of hyper glamorized, hyper positivity driven version of the 80s, and we're only thinking about the greatest hits and the best movies and the pop culture and the styles and like all of that.
Yeah, quite frankly, if we took a time machine and went back to the 80s, we'd probably be like, this place sucks.
Right, because like you're living it at a at a glacial pace, as opposed to when you're looking back on the past. It's very easy to take the best moments and compile it together and say what a great decade this was. And that's not to crap on anybody who lived through the 80s. I'm sure it was a great decade, but it's if you go back and lived it knowing sort of the best moments or the highlights, I assume it wouldn't be anywhere near as interesting because there's all that crap in between that people just don't talk about.
Yeah, we're only seeing the best hits of the 80s, whereas like there was a lot of more like music and a lot more just like stuff that happened that wasn't as great and that was kind of like meh or like just bad. But they just because they didn't let it's like there's been like a time filter and only the really good stuff has made it, and that's all we see of that era.
You brought up music, kind of using that as an analogy, and like I hope I don't like piss anybody off with this, but it's like listening to like a Beatles greatest hits album, and you're like, oh my god, every single song the Beatles ever put out is freaking amazing. And then you go back and listen to like a full album in their early discography. A lot of them are amazing, but a lot of them aren't. Some of them are just kind of forgettable, not as good songs. Not to say that the Beatles aren't very talented. Of course they were. But it's very easy when you're looking at the greatest hits version of anything to be like, man, they can do no wrong. This is amazing. And then you kind of live the moment to moment and you're like, wow, there was just a lot of filler in between here.
Yeah, some of the like Beatles songs, especially when they were trying like doing experimental stuff, are just like, you know, I'll say it's trash. Like there's this song. I don't want to burn the Beatles too much because I know Paul McCartney is an avid listener. He would come after me, but that's a joke. But I think there's a song called like Number 9 or Revolution 9 that's just like literally like an amalgamation of noise and a guy, like a British guy, repeating the phrase number 9 over and over again. And it's I think it was on I don't think it was on Dr. Sargent or Dr. Sargent.
Sergeant
Jesus.
Pepper.
Sergeant
Dr.
Pepper. Dr. Sargent Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, but I think it was around that time when that song came out. And it was just like you listen to it and it's like, oh, it's almost like you can't believe it's a Beatles song because it's like, well, Beatles makes good song and this is like almost purposefully bad.
Well, and you have to have that. You need to have that period of struggling and figuring things out and sort of that weird, awkward phase in between not knowing and knowing something, or not being good at something and being good at something. The problem is, I feel like people don't have, or at least it's much rarer to have nostalgia for that time because it very much is this awkward transitional phase. And typically either people remember the beginning of something or they remember sort of the end or the golden years of something, and I feel like they very rarely remember the period in between.
Yeah, you said awkward transitional phase, and the first thing I thought about was puberty, and I realized puberty is like a natural thing that happens to people who grow up in it, but it's also a perfect metaphor for someone who's just trying to learn how to be good at something. You have to go through that puberty phase where everything's just bad, and it's a trial and error. It's a trial and error period of like you trying something, failing, trying it again, failing.
You're freaking messing up constantly, and you look weird and you feel weird, and everyone's just kind of in this awkward just bubble all that. Yeah, I mean, puberty is a phenomenal example of that.
But then eventually, the acne clears up. You figure out your facial hair and your style, and you realize like, oh, like now I'm like the awkward phase for the most part is gone, and now I'm in this like new evolved I've gone through the cocoon, and now instead of a caterpillar I'm a beautiful butterfly.
And granted, you and I aren't that old. Puberty wasn't that long ago for us, but I feel like we're not nostalgic for most of what we were doing in puberty. When I think about nostalgia, it's usually me as a little kid, and the stuff that goes along with that. And maybe someday it'll be like, man, I wish I was 13 again, or that was a great time. But right now, I sure as heck am not. Like that's not a thought I've had.
It's too soon. I remember being at 13 and being in junior high. I don't miss that, but I think when I'm older, I'll miss that just because, you know, I was younger and I could run without getting tired.
But yeah, I mean, it is that I feel like time has to pass, and I don't know how much time that is. But it's you need to have the juxtaposition of how things used to be versus how they are now. And I feel like it's easier to be nostalgic for the times and the things that are as close to a polar opposite of what you're going through now as possible because it makes you appreciate it more. You're like, man, if only things could be that way. And in reality, it's probably good things aren't that way anymore. But because you haven't felt that in so long and you haven't had that in so long, that's kind of what you crave and your mind kind of gravitates towards is what you haven't known in a really long time.
We talked about nostalgia for a bit. We're nearing the end of the time limit for this particular podcast. So, Colin, I was just wondering, is there any kind of like particular takeaway or like but yeah, I guess takeaway is a good word for it, of like nostalgia as a concept for you?
I think I mentioned in our music episode, my favorite artist of all time is Bob Dylan. And not my favorite, but one of my favorite songs of his is "Don't Think Twice, It's All Right." And the whole sort of message of that song, I take it, because it's something I deal with, as sort of a message about anxiety and social anxiety and things like that, of stop thinking about it. Like, it happened, it's okay, move on. It's not nearly as bad as you thought it was. And I feel like it's so easy to get caught up in that. Man, if only things had gone this way, or man, if only I could have one more day doing that, or stuff like that. It's so easy to think that way that I feel like what's really important is like, just don't think twice about it. Just move on. I have this poster hanging on my wall. It's the one poster I have in my room that my parents got me. And it's Carl and Rick from The Walking Dead. And in big red text at the top, it says, "Don't look back." And they're standing on train tracks. And that's just like so powerful to me of, you've done crap, you've seen crap, you've done a million things that you wish you hadn't, and there's going to be a million more. But don't look back. It happened, it's there, it's part of you. You don't have to forget about it, but don't spend time dwelling on it and wishing you could go back there. Just take it with you and move forward. Always move forward. That's kind of what I take from nostalgia is, it's like a drug. You can appreciate. Maybe that's not a good example.
We appreciate drugs here at Naughty Adults. We endorse drugs.
It's not like a drug. That said, it's something that you can appreciate and have a place for in your life, but you can't let it consume you. You have to keep moving forward.
Yeah, I think if I had to have a takeaway for nostalgia, it would just be as fun it is and as comfortable as it is to seek out entertainment and creative arts and stories of things you're familiar with. It's also important to try to seek out unfamiliar things and things that you don't immediately recognize and things that are new to you, because there's always a chance that when you read a new book that you've never, a part of a story that you've never read, or see like a movie series you've never seen, or watch a television show, or anything, or listen to music that you've never listened to, there's always the chance that this could be your new favorite thing, or it could be trash. There's like that risk in that, but also I think it's important to like try new things and not necessarily only seek out the things that you're familiar with and things that will give you that like nostalgic tinge, but instead look towards and try to make an effort to seek out new things, because they could all of a sudden have a new place in your heart.
Folks, this has been episode 21 of the Not Yet Adults podcast. Remember, you can get the podcast every Monday and Friday at 9 a.m. Pacific time on YouTube, SoundCloud, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, iTunes, and all other podcast services. We're also all across the social medias on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Not Yet Adults, as well as on our own subreddit, r/Not Yet Adults. Check us out in all of those places. Give us some love. We sure would appreciate it. If there's one thing we would appreciate as much, if not more, however, it would be for our lovely folks that listen on iOS. Head on over to Apple Podcasts. It's the purple podcast app on your phone, and give us a rating on there. Give us a 5-star rating, or 4 stars if you're mean. Maybe leave us a review, and if we get enough reviews, we might start reading them on the show. That'd be a fun thing that we'd like to do. So it takes a couple of minutes out of your day, and it really, really helps the podcast get listened to by more people. And we put a lot of work into this podcast, so that's something that we would appreciate. We will be back this Friday at 9 a.m. Pacific time talking about something new and we are very much looking forward to it. So thanks for listening. And until next time, this has been Not Yet Adults.
Goodbye.